Hello, this is Jeff Neville for Selective Imagery. Welcome to Feeding Time at Huntington Beach State Park, which is basically a collection of various video clips from all over the park. We start with a great blue heron flying off with an eel. Not an uncommon sight early in the morning. At least somebody started off the day right. We then move on to a great egret, and this one's on the Onion Mullet Pond, on the pond side. And when you watch this clip, it's just amazing how many times you think that it's swallowed that eel, or the eel is gone, yet it continues to fight, and a little bit of it just sneaks out and wraps around the bill, and it's like the egret has to start all over again. And this isn't a very big one. I mean, sometimes there's these huge eels that get in battles with these fish. With these birds. And you'll notice that it dips it in the water. It's kind of like you dipping your bread in the olive oil, It's like, but it uses the water like a lubricant. Well, one, to clean the item if it's muddy, if it wishes to clean it, but also acts as a lubricant. And that's a very common thing. And now, we go to another great egret, and this one's on the marsh side, and you can see doing the same behavior. Dip the eel in the water, rinse it off, get it nice and wet so it can slide down easier. Now, I thought it swallowed it right there, but then, all of a sudden it just pops out of the mouth again, and okay, dip it in again. Let's try this again. It's just really crazy how many times sometimes it takes for it to actually swallow it down. Now it's going to walk out into the deeper channel of water here, do another rinse. Not like it's dipping it in gravy, like having a roast beef sandwich or something. There you go, finally gone. Now we're going to leave the marsh area and go to the beach and just watch this ring-billed gull with an early morning flight in front of the waves. But he's not the only one flying around. It's the Caspian tern, and you're going to think it's diving. It's going to dive into the water here, but it pulls up the last second, fakes you out. And of course, there's always a breeze on the beach. They're always flying into the wind, and sometimes it looks like, boy, they're working so hard and not really moving forward very fast at all. I mean, the wind sometimes just keeps them in one spot for a while. And we're going to stick with the beach area here for a little bit and watch the sanderling walk around and poke its beak into the bill, into the sand, the wet sand. And sometimes they don't go in the deeper part of the water. They'll go along the edge, like this one is, poking its head in. And they're basically looking for bugs and worms and small shellfish. And we're in slow motion right now, but that sucker still moves pretty good, even when you're watching it in slow motion. Now, some people think they're scared of the waves because if you're sitting on the beach, you'll see groups of the sanderlings, and when a wave comes in, it seems like they're always running away from the waves. It's not like they're scared of the waves, it's just that for the most part, their source of food is in the wet sand. You know, sometimes they'll poke in, you know, an inch of water, half inch of water, that type of thing, but typically when the wave starts to back up and go back into the water, goes back into the ocean and leaves that nice film of wet water on top of the sand, that's when they go to town, as you can see right here. And that's where all those small holes are on the beach when you're walking the beach and you're wondering, you know, what are all these little holes in the sand? Well, it's from these little guys. See here, they're actually in a little bit of water, which is a little bit unusual. I mean, typically when that last wave came in, they would have moved away from it a little bit, but they decided to stay in there because it wasn't like it was a huge wave. Now we switch to a wild rabbit. Let's munch it on some grasses. This was on the way leaving the beach, walking back to the parking area at the North Beach section of the park. Seems content to just sit there and look at me, not very scared of me at all. Now we switch gears and we go to the marsh side where there's a small gator going up towards the edge of the grasses and the dirt. And in a second here, you're going to see some small fish jumping around. And then it's going to do the typical behavior, and where it rolls its head, and it's actually, you know, you can't see it chewing the fish, but it rolls its head to get the fish in its mouth. And of course, these fish are so small, it can just swallow them right down. There's really not much of a need to chew. And gators don't grind their food anyway, so I mean their teeth are like pegs. It's more for gripping and holding on to the prey, not really shearing it apart. Here it's rolling its head again. Now when the water level drops for extreme low tide, before it gets to that point, these gators will leave the marsh side and they'll literally climb up the embankment on top of the rocks. And then there's some cord grass that's typically on the very top of some of the rocks, and they'll go on the sidewalk and they'll use the crosswalk that a person would use to go from the sidewalk on one side of the causeway to the other. Because once they get a little bit bigger, they can't fit underneath the guardrails, so they'll use a crosswalk just like a person. And the gators too, sometimes when they're in with a lot of small fish, and there's some in there, but not a ton, they'll blow bubbles to make them come to the top. And here we have a yellow crowned night heron sitting in a tree on a windy day, You may feel like you're getting seasick from watching these branches go up and down. It's just printing itself. This is a juvenile, and it's interesting to note that recently there's been, sometimes I'll see 4 or 5 of these in the same general area, which is a lot more than usual, and typically they're not really at uh, the pond side. I mean, this is on the pond side in a tree. They're usually either at one of the other freshwater ponds, or they're out near the nature center in the marsh feeding on fiddler crabs. So to see them in this particular area is not really common, and have not really seen the adults around, just these juveniles, which don't have their full color yet. But as you'll see in some later videos, they are interesting to watch when they hunt for their favorite food source, which is the fiddler crab. And here we switch over to the marsh side, and this is first thing in the morning, very early, probably around 6:30 a.m., where you have a various collection of wildlife. You got some wood storks, you got ibis, great egrets, tricolor herons. Now the ibis typically poke around, and they eat a lot of different things, but typically you see them getting mudworms or small eels. But they'll eat small fish, and as you'll see in a later video, they can be voracious, and with blue crabs, I mean, they'll shred a crab apart. And all these birds, even the wood storks, which are larger, when they get a crab, they just dismember it. I mean, they rip all the legs off, the claws and all the legs off. And then, depending on the size of it, they'll either swallow the body of the crab whole, or they'll split it in pieces and just rip out the meat. So it all depends on the size of the bird, the size of the crab. But you'll see some of that later on. And then we're panning over to another location where you're going to see another grouping of the birds, same birds, different spot. A lot of these clips you're seeing right now, I think from here on out, are with that new video monopod setup that I bought, and I love it. I mean, it's really making a difference in terms of how steady I can be with the video, and I hope you appreciate it. I think the quality is better, and that was my goal, to try to find something that I could put a long lens on. Now in this case, I'm not using my 500 PF, folks. Don't have a heart attack. I'm actually using my 100 to 400 with the 1.4x teleconverter. So at the long end, I'm shooting at 560 millimeters. I'll actually be shooting a lot probably in the next couple weeks. exclusively with the 100 to 400 because unfortunately I had to bring the 500 or send out the 500 PF out to Nikon for some repair. Here you can see a wood stork flying in. Sometimes the birds will gather and they could stay there for quite a while. And then other times it's almost like something spooks them, or you get a few birds to fly off and then everybody says, oh, they're going somewhere else that's better, and they all start to fly off. So when you see them, you get them when you see them, because 10 minutes later they could be in a totally different location. Now when it's low tide, the birds are typically, lots of times they're flying in from the north and they're heading towards south, towards the park. And then sometimes you see them pretty far out in the marsh, and they'll just gradually, incrementally move themselves in closer to this area as the water level drops. Now when the tide starts coming back in again, initially, that's when things can get very interesting too. Both when the tide is going out, you end up with pockets of water with stranded fish. And then when the tide starts coming back in, fish come in with the tide. So you get a fresh batch of fish coming in, and the activity picks up then as well. So you really want to time things or be around when either the tide is going out, maybe like within an hour of low tide, and then be there when the tide starts coming back in again. Now here, a little jumpy with the camera because all of a sudden I picked up on this ibis, which has a big blue crab, which is what I was talking about. And at this point, obviously the crab is dead, but it still has some appendages hanging off of it, which this ibis wants to get rid of. And it's going to do whatever it has to do to rip that claw off, as you shall see. So it's in the mode now where it's like, okay, this is my meal. I have to keep moving so no one catches up to me and tries to steal it from me. I got to get that leg off the crab, and then I can work on eating it. Here it drops it in the water, it's shaking it, trying to get that leg off, and finally it does. Now it picks it up again. Now that's too big for it to swallow whole, so it's basically just going to have to keep tenderizing it and breaking the shell casing off of that crab, and eventually just eat chunks of meat. But here, just to get away from that other ibis, it's walking on top and in between the oyster beds. There's a lot of oysters in here, and you don't see them when it's high tide, but as soon as the tide pulls out, then all these oyster beds are exposed. And some birds, they walk in between and around these oysters, and that's where they find food as well. Fiddler crabs will hide in there. Mudworms will be in there in between the oysters. Okay, so here it's going to feel threatened with that other bird, and eventually it's just going to disappear, take off. And here we go to another grouping, small grouping of 3 ibis. And they're typically always around the interface, the edge between where the muddy banks are and the water. And you can see that they're all out there. You can see all the oyster beds. Now we switch to a yellow-crowned night heron, and it's feeding. And if you look to the right, you can see a hole, couple holes in the mud, and there's a fiddler crab in one of those holes, and it knows it's in there. And I did a video before showing the feeding behavior of this bird, which is really amazing. You know, it knows what it's going to get, and when it gets closer to actually attacking it, its back end will wiggle back and forth. The head might wiggle back and forth. A little bit of water, like you just saw there, dripped off the beak, and before you know it, it's going to attack and grab that crab. So here it is, moving a little bit closer, edging a little bit closer, making sure it has some leverage. It's doing its little wobble. It's looking, it's going to be getting it any second now. Come on. Here we go. Do it. There we go. And we got a few more clips coming up of this same bird getting some more crabs. There's that rocking action. Now, if you look towards the edge of the water, well, there's like a leaf sticking in the mud, and there's a crab to the left of that, and there's also one along the edge of the water. So there's two crabs there, but it's looking at the one that's next to the leaf that's stuck in the mud. The funny thing is, you say, well, it could have gotten it 10 times by now. So there's this process that it goes through. I don't know if the head wobble is the focus, confuse the enemy, or what have you. That got a good size one there. And here we go with the last clip of the bird getting another fiddler crab. But the process is, it isn't fast. I mean, it takes its time. I don't think I've ever seen one miss. Maybe there's something to be said of it being a little bit patient. Here we go. Here's a little bit of the rocking action. It's leaning forward a little bit, so it's imminent. Okay. There's that rock. Go, another good sized one. And since it's right next to the water, it's going to rinse it off and then swallow it down. For this last clip, we're just going to show you the sun just came up, looking at the marsh side. And you can see the walking area, which is near a nature center. Then there's an observation booth there that has a roof over it, which is handy when the rain starts to come. But there can be hundreds of birds in those grasses, and you can't see them. When they're ready, you'll see them. But eventually they'll fly out and they'll move closer and closer, and they'll get to, like I said, to when it's low tide to get the fish and everything. So hopefully you enjoyed these clips. Please give me a thumbs up, a like, and some comments, and share with other people. And until next time, remember my slogan: enjoy life, capture some of it.